I'm going to start by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Brona Byrne, who's a senior lecturer in social policy and co-director of the Centre for Children's Rights, co-founder of the Disability Research Network at Queen's University Belfast. So Brona is the perfect person to lead us off in this discussion on the human rights obligations of states under the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I'll introduce the other speakers as they appear. So over to you, Brona.
Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? I presume that, yeah. I'm deaf, so I'm lip reading, so I can't hear if people are saying yes or no. Okay, so I'm absolutely delighted to be here today and to give you a general overview of the human rights provisions and protection for disabled children and young people in international law. I just think it's so exciting that we have a summer school focused specifically on disabled children and young people. So in the next 20 minutes or so, and I trust Eleanor to keep an eye on my time, I'm going to give a general overview of the key human rights provisions, focusing particularly on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, or the CRC, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD. Before I do that, I want to highlight the importance of looking at the intersectionality of disability and childhood, and the importance of international law in reflecting that intersectionality. We've already heard this morning from Nicola about the discrimination that disabled children and young people face. They often experience double discrimination because they experience discrimination on the grounds of disability and on the grounds of age. But they also experience a distinct form of discrimination because of the intersection between disability and age. So they experience discrimination in a way that is different from other children, and they also experience it in a way that's different from adults with disabilities. So international law becomes a really important tool to address the intersectional discrimination and the specific experiences of that population group. So the way in which international law conceptualizes the content, the type of international law, has particular implications for the types of measures that state parties must take across law, policy, and practice. That's why it's important to look critically at the provisions across international law instruments. What have rights for disabled children looked like? Well, before 1989, the intersectionality of disability and childhood was not reflected in general international law instruments. So we're talking about instruments such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Covenant on Economic, Social and Economic Rights. None of those instruments specifically address disability or age, never mind the combination of those two grounds. What did that mean? Well, it meant that we had rights in theory for disabled children and young people, but they remained invisible in practice. And it has been argued that international law has been based on an ableist discourse, in the sense that it reflects rights designed for white, middle-aged, straight, able rights holders or human beings. So it wasn't designed with children or disabled people in mind. And as Nicola reflected earlier on, disabled children and young people have been viewed as problems rather than as rights holders. Rights have been deemed irrelevant to their experience, with the focus on trying to cure or fix disabled children and young people. So why should we look at rights, of human rights? So I want to move on to look specifically at the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. At that point, in 1989, we began to see a positive shift in human rights discourse. The CRC, or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, was seminal and significant in providing comprehensive human rights protections for all children, irrespective of their background, where they came from. But it also was important because it covered most aspects of children's lives. For disabled children, the CRC is particularly significant for a number of reasons, which I'm going to look at. And you have access to the material that I am talking about, I think, on Discord. You have access to PowerPoint slides. For the first time in binding international law, the CRC prohibits discrimination on the grounds of disability. Before that, we had general human rights instruments that looked at the right to non-discrimination and listed a whole range of grounds within that, but disability and age were not included in those. So the CRC is really significant because the word disability is, for the very first time, mentioned in a human rights treaty and a human rights text. The CRC is also really significant because, for the first time in a human rights treaty, it includes a disability-specific provision, a standalone provision solely on disability. So obviously this is incredibly positive, really, really powerful, and we need to remember the time in which this was adopted, 1989. So it was in a time when discourses and understandings of disability were still predominantly medicalised and deficit-based. So it's really important that this was included. Article 23, which is the disability-specific provision, is set out in 3 parts. And it addresses the rights of disabled children to, among other things, enjoy a full and decent life, to assistance, to support and services, for example, in relation to education, to health, to rehabilitation, and a whole range of other services. However, despite this positivity, and we can't take away from that, Article 23 has also been critiqued. And I want to highlight some of those critiques and limitations. So, for example, it argues or states that children with disabilities should enjoy a full and decent life and to special care and assistance. So the reference around special care, special needs, reminds us of a rather medicalised discourse and way of looking and understanding disabled children and young people. It says that disabled children and young people should enjoy a decent life. Okay, so if we think about the language of that for a moment, the other rights within the CRC say that children generally shall enjoy rights. So that word shall is much stronger and it's much more positive than should. Should do something is essentially aspirational, and it doesn't bring with it any particular obligations on state. So that's one way in which rights for disabled children have been different from rights for children generally. The rights set out in the CRC in Article 23 are also rather conditional. And again, Nicola referred to the conditionality of rights that disabled children and young people can sometimes have. For example, it includes language such as subject to available resources. Again, would we accept that for children generally, that their rights are contingent on the availability of resources? It talks about the eligible child whenever possible, and taking into account the financial resources of parents and others caring for the child. So we can begin to see why it's really significant. It's certainly not a perfect provision. I also want just to highlight one other right in the CIC, which is important for disabled children, and that is Article 12 of the CIC. And Article 12 highlights the right of children to express their views. This is really important because both children, and particularly disabled children, have been assumed to lack capacity to make any decisions for themselves. So Article 12 assures to the child who is capable of forming his or her own views the right to express those views freely in all matters affecting them. The views of the child being given due weight in accordance with their age and maturity. So one criticism of that has been that it seems to have some kind of competency test, and that it requires the child to be capable of forming their own views. That can be an issue for children generally, but for disabled children, how might they be perceived or assessed by various services and professionals? And they may be more likely to be seen not as capable of expressing their views. And also, their views need to be given due weight. What do we mean by due weight? How do we assess that? And who decides? So Article 12 is one of 4 rights identified by the CIC Committee as a cross-cutting general principle. And the other 3 general principles are the right to non-discrimination, the best interest principle, and the right to life, survival, and development. So I want to move on now to the UNCIPD. What have they said? What has that instrument said about the rights of disabled children? Well, the CIPD adopts what we call a combined mainstreaming approach to the rights of disabled children. And by that we mean that it contains a standalone provision specifically on the rights of disabled children, which is Article 7. But it also makes a number of specific references to disabled children and childhood age or age appropriate throughout other rights within the treaty. So what does Article 7 say? As you can see from the text, if you've read it, it integrates the substantial provisions of the CIC, but it strengthens them by putting a disability lens upon it. So it makes it more focused. Article 7 is divided into 3 parts. The first part requires state parties to take all necessary measures to ensure the full enjoyment by children of their rights on an equal basis with others. That phrase, on an equal basis with others, is really important, and again is different from the CIC. And it's important because it focuses on equality of disabled children and young people with other children, and no matter what rights that they enjoy. The second part of Article 7 says that in all action concerning children with disabilities, the best interest of the child shall be a primary consideration. Again, that language is taken across from the CIC. And the last part of Article 7 focuses on the right of disabled children to express their views. So again, it takes that directly across from the CIC. However, 7.3 is much stronger than the CIC. So if you remember a few minutes ago, I talked about how the CIC talked about a child being capable of forming their views. That phrase is not contained within the CIPD. It has been taken out of the CIPD. So there's no competency test there. There's a presumption of capacity. That's really, really important. And the other important aspect is the add-on phase at the end, which requires state parties to provide children with disability and age-appropriate support to allow them to express their views. So it recognises that disabled children and young people can express their views and that they might need some kind of support in order to do that. So again, it's really, really important and ways in which the CIPD builds on and strengthens the CIC. It's also really interesting to note that the CIPD committee has made a number of references to children in their general comments. For example, General Comment 7 calls on state parties to adopt legislation, regulations, and develop programs to ensure that everyone understands and respects the will and preferences of children and considers their personal evolving capacity at all times. So there's a direct requirement there on state parties to respect and promote the will and preferences of disabled children. And there's a clear link there to Article 12, which I think you'll hear more about tomorrow, of the CIPD, which focuses on equal recognition before the law. There are also references to children and or age across 11 other rights or provisions within the CIPD, including a general principle, respect for evolving capacities of the child. It's mentioned in terms of awareness raising, education, health, respect for home and family, participation in cultural life, recreation and support. The final thing I want to make reference to is the importance of disabled children and young people in the monitoring and implementation of the CIPD. So it's not enough just to give them rights. They also need to be actively involved in monitoring the implementation of the CIPD. And this is most clearly set out in Article 4.3 of the CIPD, which requires states to actively consult with and involve disabled children, including through their representative organisations. Now, there's been an issue there in terms of the relatively few organisations that are focused on disabled children. They tend to fall between organisations focused on disability generally or children generally. However, the CIPD committee has emphasised, again in its General Comment 7, that state parties should resource and create an enabling environment for the establishment of new representative organisations for children and young people with disability. So it's important that the focus specific organisations are established. Cliona mentioned earlier on the joint working group between the CIC and the CIPD. So since 2009, we have seen a more positive approach being taken by the CIC committee in their concluding observations, and we can see the influence of the CIPD within that instrument. And it's really good to see both committees now working together on areas of tension and areas that need to be addressed. And one of those tense areas is around alternative care for disabled children and young people. And they've issued a joint statement that was last year, 2022, talking about how they reaffirm the rights of disabled children and young people. So that's a really general overview of the key provisions in the CIC and the CIPD. Like Eleanor with her area of interest, I could talk about this for 7 days as well, but I won't expose you to that. The CIC was a really important starting point. The CIPD has built on that, strengthened that, And we're also seeing the diversity of disabled children and young people being recognised, which again is really, really significant. They're not a homogenous group. They all come from different backgrounds. But as with everything, implementation and monitoring is absolutely critical. The excuse of resources or limited resources used by third parties is something that we need to keep an eye on, and we need to get actively involved in implementation and monitoring. Thank you.
Moving on from there, we'll now hear more about the CRPD from Rosemary Case, who is a human rights lawyer working in disability policy and reform, who is an active member of the ad hoc committee that negotiated the convention, and so is the exact right person to tell us about what the obligations are. And she's also currently the vice chair of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Rosemary is a summer school returning speaker for several years, since the very beginning of summer school, and we're delighted to have you with us again in Galway, fresh out of the Conference of States Parties in New York last week. So over to you, Rosemary.
It's lovely to be back in Galway. I think it's 5 years since I was here, or 4 years since I was here. And it's really good to be back and to see it so well attended, and to know that there is the ability for people to be joining us online. Coming from the Antipodes, it's really nice to know that there are other ways of participating in stuff that happens in this side of the world, apart from getting on a plane for a very long time. Brona has not left me much left to discuss. That was an excellent overview of both CRC and CRPD provisions. What I do have to say may be cut short, because I would just be repeating what she's outlined for us. But fundamentally, as Brona introduced to you, the CRPD is the thematic treaty that applies human rights in the context of disability, including for children and youth with disabilities. What's fundamental to the CRPD is that impairment, or as it's more commonly referred to, disability, has long been an exception for the application of human rights and fundamental freedoms, with rights being denied or diminished on the basis of impairment. The denial and diminishment of rights is often seen as benevolent, protective, and necessary because of the ableist perception that reduces people with disabilities to objects of care, treatment, and protection. For CRPD, a human rights approach requires the recognition that impairment is one aspect of human diversity, that no human being has the complete repertoire of abilities, and that impairment should never be the basis for the denial or diminishment of human rights. This holds true for adults as well as for children and youth with disability. So ableism is at the core of the power relations that privilege people without disability and devalue people with disability. The power relations inherent to ableism and those inherent to, for example, racism, sexism, ageism, and cis heterosexism all share a common space of the devalued other, in contrast to the privileged norm of humanness. The CRPD challenges ableism, and by challenging ableism, it benefits all of us who fall into the category of devalued other. Ableist attitudes underpin our devalued cultural and social perceptions of people with disability and are embedded in the structures and institutions of our society. The social transformation required to guarantee human rights will require not only attitudinal change, but structural and systemic reform. The CRPD was the first human rights treaty adopted in the 21st century. It shifts our understanding of disability from one of individual deficit, requiring care, treatment and protection, to a human rights model that affirms that all people with disability are of equal worth and value and must be afforded all human rights and fundamental freedoms on an equal basis with others. Central to this is the recognition that disability is one of several layers of identity. Preambular paragraph P of the Convention acknowledges the different layers or intersections of identity and recognises that this can result in intersectional discrimination and inequality. Other international human rights treaties have also recognised different layers of identity, but the Convention is the first human rights treaty to explicitly and comprehensively address intersectional discrimination. Intersectional discrimination recognises the multidimensional layers of identities, statuses and life realities that interact with each other at the same time in such a way as to be inseparable. It acknowledges that people with disability do not experience discrimination and inequality as a homogenous group. While intersectional discrimination is specifically articulated in the Convention in Article 6, Women with Disabilities, and Article 7, Children with Disabilities, it is critical to recognise that Articles 6 and 7 are illustrative of intersectionality and not exhaustive. Article 7 is a cross-cutting article. And the article on children with disabilities facilitates the application of all the substantive articles of the Convention in regards to children and youth. Article 7 harmonises the legal standards of the Convention on the Rights of the Child with the CRPD, the specialist treaty with regard to children with disabilities. The CRPD reaffirms that all children with disabilities should be able to exercise and enjoy all human rights and fundamental freedoms on an equal basis with other children. CRPD reaffirms the best interests of the child standard, but also recognises the evolving capacities of children and overlays this with a will and preference standard and the requirement for measures to facilitate supported decision-making. As Nicola pointed out to us, human rights standards are often not adhered to by states. Exceptions to the realisation of rights are made on the basis of impairment, denying people with disabilities the enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. But the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities have noticed a range of areas in which children with disabilities have had their rights violated, including in personal autonomy, family life, sexual and reproductive rights, and education. Both treaty bodies have expressed concern to states parties about the high numbers of children with disability that continue to be placed in institutions. Both have urged states parties to implement deinstitutionalisation programs and to provide all necessary support to ensure children with disabilities can live in their family or in alternative family care in the community. The process of deinstitutionalisation has often been one where large institutions are replaced by smaller residential care facilities or group homes. The CRPD recognises that residential care facilities or group homes, regardless of their size, configuration or quality of care, are no substitute for the right to family life. Family-like situations are still institutions. There is significant evidence that damningly demonstrates that significant harm, violence, abuse and neglect is experienced by children within institutional care, including within smaller residential settings and group homes. We need to recognise that alternative care for children in institutions, including within smaller residential care facilities or group homes, is a denial of the right to family life and a form of discrimination. Any transformation of the system towards family and community-based care requires states to develop and implement deinstitutionalisation strategies, including with regard to smaller residential care facilities or group homes. It requires measures such as redirecting efforts, resources and funding to fully support children and their families to maintain strong and cohesive family environments, to establish and provide alternative family care, such as foster care, kinship care, shared family care or extended family care, to ensure the provision of individual age-appropriate information, supports and programs to respond to the needs of children, and awareness-raising strategies to promote the rights of children with disabilities and their inclusion and participation in family and community life. For children, the core of the right to family life entails the right to grow up in a family. The Convention on the Rights of the Child affirms that everyone, including children, have the right to autonomy and self-determination over their own bodies. This is the principle of bodily integrity, which upholds everyone's right to be free from acts against their body which they do not consent to. As a committee, we continually have reports of violations of the right to bodily integrity, especially for children and youth with disability. For example, many people with disability don't have the power to make their own decisions, and others make decisions on their behalf. This could be through formal guardianship arrangements or through informal decision-making by parents, carers, support workers, medical professionals, and others. In terms of sexual and reproductive rights, third-party consent and decision-making violates the universal standard of bodily integrity and autonomy. Changing this situation will require a fundamental shift in law and policy to recognise the right of people with disabilities to make their own decisions, in establishing supported decision-making mechanisms and in challenging vested interests involved in guardianship and ensuring that the universal standard of bodily integrity and autonomy are accorded to people with disability on an equal basis with others. The CRPD reaffirms autonomy, bodily integrity, health and privacy and freedom from torture, violence and abuse, and applies these principles to the unique and specific violations of sexual and reproductive rights that are experienced by children and youth with disability, such as forced sterilisation, forced contraception, forced menstrual suppression, forced abortion, growth attenuation treatment, intersex genital mutilation, conversion therapies, denial of sexual and gender expression, removal of children, denial of parenthood and sexual relationships. The Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has addressed the issue of forced sterilisation and violations of sexual and reproductive rights since its inception in 2008. Not only is this issue one that is consistently brought to the Committee's attention by organisations of persons with disabilities and other stakeholders, it is an issue that the Committee consistently raises in our dialogues with states parties from all regions. The Committee continues to be unequivocal in its position that forced sterilisation and other violations of sexual and reproductive rights should be prohibited. This position has been outlined in its 2016 General Comment number 3 on women and girls with disabilities, in its 2018 joint statement with the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women regarding sexual and reproductive rights for women with disabilities, and repeatedly reinforced in concluding observations to states parties. And just to pick up on and my final point is just to pick up on what Brona outlined in her introductory words, was that one critical area that is important in the CRPD is Article 4.3. There's a general obligation on states parties to ensure that people with disabilities are closely consulted and actively involved in the process of policy making in decisions that affect their lives. This is critical for children and youth with disability. And as Brona pointed out, there are measures that states parties can take to ensure that there is an enabling environment for children and youth with disabilities to have their own organisations and be politically active. As we can see, youth can be very, very powerful activists. Nicola's keynote speech this morning was a fabulous demonstration of that activism. I wish you all very well for the rest of the summer school, and know that your activism going forward will be very powerful for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. I think that's a really useful insight into the kinds of issues that are coming up for the committee when having these dialogues with states about what they still need to accomplish to achieve the rights of children with disabilities under that convention. We're now going to have a presentation from Danius Puris. Danius is the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health, in which he focused very much on the right to mental health, and we'll be hearing from Danius more later in the week in person, but he has recorded this video about his experience when he was on the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, which was from 2007 to 2011, and about the kinds of issues that they came across on that committee concerning the rights of children with disabilities. And Danius has joined us online as well for the Q&A of this session. So we'll play Danius's video recording now, and then we'll go into the Q&A session.
Hello to everyone. I'm Danius Pouras. I'm happy to contribute to this panel by sharing my experience when I was a member of a distinguished body, Committee on the Rights of the Child. Well, it was quite many years ago, so I may not remember exactly things which were happening. Anyway, it is a pleasure to share my memories. I was serving as a member of CRC committee from 2007 to 11, one term. And one thing was that when I came to Geneva, when I started, that was my first experience with United Nations, and I had to learn a lot. I did not know UN language, I did not know abbreviations, and yes, then it's very important not to be afraid to ask more experienced colleagues in the committee, and I was doing this, and I was learning a lot. And I was happy because we had a very strong composition of committee. We had a very good balance. We had 8 lawyers and 8 others, non-lawyers. Both the groups are very important, equally important, I should say. And we had our gurus, we had prominent experts, professionals, like I was amateur, and I remain, I think, amateur because my background is medicine. It's the only diploma I have. And we had Jean Zermatt, and we had Lothar Krapman, we had Hyang-Hee Lee, and many other distinguished experts, and I was learning a lot. To come maybe closer to the issue of children with disabilities, what is important to say that just before I became a member of CRC, the committee issued a general comment number 9 on the rights of children with disabilities. This happened in 2006. Exactly, this is the year when another important convention on the rights of persons with disabilities was born. So in that general comment, we still do not read about CRPD, but we can feel already the spirit. And when I came to the committee, well, my experience was rich already, but it was regional experience. It was experience from my region, let's say Central Eastern Europe, we can say post-Soviet region, and I had a lot of experience as a child-adolescent psychiatrist, but also as working a lot with civil society about negative aspects of this Soviet experiment, let us say. And my warming up was probably through being expert in the beginning, being competent in when delegations were coming for the dialogue from that region. And I was explaining often to my colleagues from other countries about very peculiar things which were created in that region for different, including ideological reasons. And I think it is still important for us to remember that things are going wrong not only because of neoliberalism. Sometimes things are going wrong from some fake socialism, which was, in my view, Soviet Union, Soviet experiment. I spent half of my life there, and I'm expert. And when one country was coming, for example, from that region, and they chose Russian language for the dialogue, which, as we know, Russian is one of UN languages. And then there was a moment when a head of delegations from that country, Russian-speaking country, he was deputy minister, he was experienced politician, and he was telling this about the situation in the country. And when he raised the issue of children with disabilities, something happened that my colleagues in the committee from other countries, especially from, let's say, so-called Western countries, they expressed some emotions. They were shocked. They stopped the speech of the deputy minister, and they asked what is happening here, because they could not tolerate the wording which was used. And then it was an interesting moment, because the deputy minister told, "Oh, madam, most likely interpretation is wrong." So then was my role. I understood that I am the person who understands what is happening here. And I explained that, and first of all, I praised the interpreters for perfect job, because they did not hide the formulation, the terminology the deputy minister was using. They could do this, but I think they chose the good way to leave this terminology. Sadly, we have many children with defects and with severe defects, and in the future we will do everything that such children do not exist, but the defectologists are working hard to sort out which of them may be somehow still of use, and which of them are their life has no sense, something like that. But especially this terminology like defects, defectologists, this was very important to translate correctly and not to hide and to say that children with disabilities. And then we did educational work. We explained to the members of delegation that such terminology should not be used, and that terminology means a lot. Terminology such terminology by itself creates and sustains severe problems in the system. And then the other thing was that the colleagues in committee could not understand, when countries from my region were coming, why they have such a strange system for caring children with disabilities and without disabilities. For example, why baby homes, like orphanages, why they are turned into medical facilities with doctors working there, and as if these are hospitals for sick, for ill children. And when they grow, when they get older, these children, when they reach school age, those who have milder conditions, they go to live to places which are institutions, but why they are called schools? And why they belong to system of education if children live there? so-called boarding schools for so-called mildly mentally retarded. So again, I had to explain the sophisticated game which was played during Cold War, of course, by both camps. But I was expert of Soviet camp. I was spying for many years how things are developing there. And for the committee, somebody had to explain this, cheating game, because the Soviet Union was explaining to the rest of the world that they do not have any longer any social problems because they defeated capitalism. And then they had to hide social problems. So for this, they told that all children who are in orphanages, baby homes, are severely ill children. They are ill with, maybe mental retardation again, and something like that. But the causes can be only biological, only genetical, and not social. And again, when they go to these institutions, there is not a social problem. They receive their education. So the system is perfect. And, I know that there were many people in the West, and still there are many people in the West who think that countries like Soviet Union, at least this is much better scenario than some, neoliberal country. So this was important for us to talk about. And when there was, during one session, there was coincidence that two neighboring countries were coming for dialogue, and that was Belarus and Ukraine, countries which we are talking a lot about now. So, and again, my colleagues asked me, maybe you can explain why there is such a big difference between these two countries. But they saw this difference in the way that Belarus is doing well, because there no problems. The streets are beautiful and clean, and there are no street children, no begging, no drug addicts, nothing. While in Ukraine, there was a lot of problems, including drug use among children and adolescents, and many social problems. So why Belarus is doing so well and Ukraine is doing so badly? And I had explained that process of democracy started in Ukraine already. It was 15 years ago. But things were starting already, and when things start, all negative things are in the surface. This is what democracy brings first. It's not hidden any longer, and Belarus is still dictatorship, is still sterile on the surface. So this we had to talk about. I was very happy with my colleagues to discuss with each year. I remind that I was for one term only, so 4 years. And with each year, I think now that the influence of CRPD convention was felt more and more, which was, of course, good. Because when you read, for example, if you read this general comment from 2006 from CRC committee, and you read a classical thing that committee urges state parties to use the placement in institution. It's about institutionalization of children with disabilities as only as a measure of last resort, when it is absolutely necessary and in the best interest of the child. And then, in addition, attention should be paid to transforming existing institutions with a focus on small residential care facilities organized around the rights and the needs of the child, and so on. So, as you see, the CRC committee is allowing this kind of compromise that institutions could be as good as possible, as small as possible, used as last resort. But we know from reality what happens with such recommendations, that many countries are using this as excuse. And, when they reduce number of children from 200 to 100, or let's say to 50, I do not think this, in one institution, I do not think that this is what we should keep recommending. So CRPD convention, of course, is the convention which lifted the bar high as it should be. And CRPD committee is doing a lot of good work to pushing countries to fully implement rights of children and adults with all disabilities. Maybe with limited success this is happening, but somebody has to remind this. While CRC convention, well, it was born as a baby of, quite a good baby of Cold War, with a lot of compromises which were needed at that time. It's still a miracle that they managed to agree in the 80s by suggestion from communist Poland and then Western countries joining. So it was a good convention. But we can see that this convention allows different understanding. And then some opponents of ours may use it, while manipulating. As we know, this question remains very important about institutions, about exceptions, about last resort. And the question which for me was most important when I was in CRC committee and remains now is that still many countries are reliant, maybe not openly now, but in a hidden way, on two approaches which have good intentions but are harmful. This is a charity approach, and this is a biomedical approach in narrow sense, which the approach which confronts with spirit and letter of CRPD convention. And back to work we were doing in the committee, one of problems created is this cluster. When you go through issues, and you come to cluster was 7. Now it's, I think, letter F, which is disabilities, which is about basic health and welfare, which includes disability. So it's a marriage, of disabilities with healthcare. Like something reminding this old tradition of disability being sort of medical condition. So we should be very clear about opposing this biomedical thinking and biomedical practices when issues of children and adults with disability come. I will be speaking more on this on Monday when I elaborate on the right to mental health, and then I will talk what I was doing when, after some years, I came back to Geneva and the position of special rapporteur on the right to health. And for now, thank you for your attention.